Make sure Jan's in.
I think.
All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? If other people jump in as we go, that'd be great. Chapter 11. Let's see if I can find it again. Is almost all yellow in my book. I mean, he had so much to say in that chapter that, you know, I don't know as a talk. I'm going to do my darndest to summarize it, but I'm going to miss 90% of the really good stuff. So if you haven't read chapter 11 or you know, you may want to read it again. Basically what he's doing here is he's transitioning back to broader concerns, basically societal concerns. We have been talking a little bit in a couple of the earlier chapters about personal things, more what does it mean to me personally, and now he's broadening it back out again. His subtitle was, does loving mean avoiding politics? Does caring for other people mean avoiding politics? And you know, he's obviously, his answer is no, and it doesn't mean we back away and don't get involved. Or give Jen a second to get on. Oh. There she is. All right. So what Curry is asking is, and you know, everybody who preaches, or basically does any other public speaking, has this issue of, particularly nowadays with the division and the anger in our society, is, would it be better to just not bring any of this stuff up? But yet it's important, so I should talk about it. How do I talk about it? And all this kind of thing. And it's even beyond public speakers, of course. It's you going for a walk with your neighbor, or simply running into somebody in the grocery store. What do you do about all the debate, all the nastiness going on? And he has two comments that I think kind of summarize it. He says, first of all, he says extremists are drowning out the majority. And if you stop and think about that, that's a fairly optimistic comment about who is in the majority. So he says extremists are drowning out the majority. Then he says, if decent people sit this out, we're handing the country over to the extremists. And then he asks the question, how can we productively engage? And that word in productively is really what the rest of the chapter is about. He's talking about how can we make a difference. He means productively in the sense of how can we accomplish something. And his comment, and I think this is really difficult, engaging the issues while honoring many viewpoints. And that brought me back to our baptismal covenant, where every time there's a baptism in the Episcopal Church, everyone present makes certain vows before God again, and one of them is to respect the dignity of every human being. And personally, I frequently, before I even respond to that, I say, God, you know I'm not going to keep this one. I may try, but I'm going to fail a whole lot more often than I succeed. But I think that's kind of where he's going, is respecting people. That does not mean agreeing with them. It doesn't even necessarily mean to say they've got a reasonable argument. I don't know if we need to go there, but it's important to respect the person and let them know you do. One of my favorite stories along this line is Fred Horton, a priest in the Episcopal Church, was chair of the Old Testament department at Wake Forest University, and make a long story short, we were in a Bible study, and I distinctly remember, I have no idea what they said, but somebody commented on a passage that made a comment that was so ridiculous, everybody else knew it was ridiculous. And we're all sitting there trying to think, what can we say? And Fred looked at her and said, "That's fascinating. Most people believe," and went on and straightened it out. She was corrected, she was respected, she was honored as a person, and her opinion, her thought wasn't denigrated, but at the same time he cleared it up. I thought that was just I've stolen that approach on more than one occasion. Then on page 229, Curry is looping back to his background in literature, and he talks about the Grand Inquisitor. And he says, Curry says, the further Christianity has strayed from our roots, his teachings, his examples, the reality of Jesus' risen life, the more we betray him. The more we remain silent or commit evils that have hurt and harmed God's creation. And to my mind, left the line from one of our confession, things done and things left undone. My suspicion is most of the people on this Zoom and most of the people in most churches have no major, really terrible things to confess that they've done. We all have some. But our bigger sins are things left undone. And I'll leave you to decide if that's true for you. Curry goes on to say, and this I think is where he's been trying to go with the whole book, love is a game changer, shaping every decision we make, no matter what part of life. And you may recall he listed different, as a parent, as a teacher, as a neighbor. I don't remember all the ones he listed. I'm probably adding something, as a politician, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he's raising the question, what about when our Christian belief conflicts with our civic rules and we are in a position of being an elected or appointed official? I've thought of a number of examples to use here, but each one is so hot button, I decided to stay away from it. So let me give you a totally ridiculous example. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the excuse me a second, send her the new link.
Okay, can I do it via this?
Yeah, should be able to.
Okay.
Hold on, somebody's having a hard time checking in. Here, let me.
Okay.
Take a short break. Let me see if I figure out how to do this. One too many. Where is it? There it is.
The tech master.
How do I get her to? Oh, wait a minute. Oh, lordy, 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 lordy. Oh, hold on. I apologize. Let me try it this way. There we go. Forward. Wendy. All right, that should do it.
Thank you.
With luck. That does it. So as I say, I'm going to use a really crazy example. But I think you'll get the I think you can take other words and put them where the words I'm using fit, and you'll understand where I'm going. Let's assume for a moment that it's against the law in the United States to use the color green. Any use of the color green is against the law. But let's assume that from something in the Bible, Christians believe all colors are of equal value. And now imagine you're a judge, and a case comes before you about using the color green. You are in a position where either the American law or the Christian teaching is going to take precedent. And I think it's a shame, because one of the things we tend to do is assume it's not possible for there to be a conflict between those two. But the fact of the matter is there can be times that there is. Now, what Bishop Curry says, and he goes on, he uses some examples of him working with the North Carolina legislature. He said that the key is basically to find things we can agree on. And he talked about going into a higher plane. I tend to think of it as going to more foundational questions. That what is it that we can agree on from which we can build something? And he uses the example of some laws. I remember one was on immigration. I don't recall the other one. And where they began talking about the Christian understanding of the need to care for our neighbors, to care for other people. Began there, and then talked about the implications of the law that had been proposed. Look for shared values is the phrase he kept using. And then on page 232, he makes a very important point. He says, the results are not going to be perfect. The results are not going to be perfect. And I think this is one of the problems we're having at both ends of the political spectrum right now, is a desire for perfection as they understand it. And there's a saying in business, and it's said 100 different ways, but it's basically comes down to, don't let the desire for the perfect prevent the accomplishment of the pretty good. Trying to make it perfect and not making any advantages, any movement forward is not a good thing. Accomplish what you can. And then on 235, Curry says, it's true there are some matters on which we simply won't agree. But he goes on and he says, but you don't build on the negative. And that's one of those sentences that can easily be misunderstood. I think the emphasis has to be on the word don't. And I believe where he's going is, it is not possible to build on the negative. If we begin with the negative, we're going to get nowhere. We're just going to set somebody else in concrete so they won't move. You know, there's an old thing that they do in all kinds of small group training and stuff, which is, you know, if you do this against somebody, they're going to push back. And what you want to do is find a way to not be in that kind of conflict, if at all possible. I am intrigued that, and I'd be really curious to hear his comments about the last point he makes in this chapter, and whether or not it feels like something he wrote the chapter and went back and read it again and said, oops, I need to say this. Because he says we are to witness not to religion, but to faith. And I heard that as not to institutional, denominational religion, but to God. And like I said, that felt to me like something he wrote the whole paragraph and then he came back, or the whole chapter, maybe the whole book. And he came back and he said, that I can hear people misunderstanding this. I need to make this clear. All right, chapter 12 is basically one major thought. And that's there are places, times, situations in which it feels like the divine and the human are closer together than at other places. And it still is. There are various places that people say anyone who walks there feels like they're walking in the presence of the divine. But I like the fact he talked about situations as well, and particularly personal interactions. And knowing Bishop Curry, that I can really believe that. He is such a personal interactor that's where he finds the places where the divine and the human come closer together. And one of the things I picked up as I was reading this is the thin place or situation or whatever feels so good, but it's not a place we can live in. And the parallel I've used before that I like is a thin place is a little like a water fountain. It's a place you go and you fill your thirst, but then you leave to go do what needs to be done. You can't live there. Another way to look at it scripturally is a transfiguration, where the disciple, Peter in particular, offered to build 3 booths so people could stay on the mountaintop. And Jesus said no and led him off the mountaintop. So they had the experience of a really thin place, but they couldn't live there. They had to go on and do their ministry. They had to do what they needed to do. Bishop Curry ends this chapter with with 5 short phrases to try to pull it all together. He says, don't give up on love. Remember, he talked about how in dealing with like the state legislature and stuff, the results will not be perfect. People will still, honestly, will still hate us, even if we treat them well. You're almost certain to run into somebody that is just gonna, you can't believe the way they treat you. And it'd be so easy to say this caring for other people doesn't work. I have a friend, and we can argue the philosophy and the theology another time. But I have a friend who says the only reason you won't be having trouble is because you are boring to the devil. If you're trying to do God's work, you will notice, and whether or not they're being given to you or you're just noticing them, you will notice the conflicts. And Curry's point is don't give up on it. Don't stop trying. He says, listen to it, trust it, give into it. And that again, for me, that was the most fascinating one, because I'm the type of person that I can have this philosophy over here on the side, and I can reach out and pull elements of it and use them, as I want to, basically an intellectual exercise. What Curry is saying is, rather than that, we need to live into it. It needs to be part of us. It needs to be, if you will, the clothing on us. And we'll get into that in a minute in the appendix. And finally, obey it. And I thought it was interesting. He started with don't give up and ended with obey. That feels like a connection there, kind of wrapping it all together. All right, before we go on to the appendix, any thoughts, comments, questions? And those of you who are muted, feel free to unmute at this point. We'll go into discussion time. Let me get over here. Well, we got the appendix is Bishop Curry's attempt to help us take all this and apply it in our own lives. That what we want to do is be able to actually implement some of the things he's been talking about. And it's very important. He says a rule of life is not meant to control us as much as to support us or guide us, to provide some help in accomplishing what it is we want to accomplish. And that's really important because this is not something that's imposed from outside. This is decisions we make about what we want to do. And he talks about how, and he has the tips on page, I think it's 251, about being realistic, about be loving. And the fascinating thing about that, the first time I started reading that, I said, well, of course we're going to be loving. That's what this whole book's about. But then I realized what he meant was be loving to ourselves. Love your neighbor as yourself has to start with loving yourself. And don't wait. And I think we're somewhat back to what I said about don't let the desire for the perfect prevent the accomplishment of the pretty good. We're not going to get it all done. And the question we should always be asking ourselves is something along the lines of, what can I do now? And what can I have done a week from now or a month from now or some period, remembering at all times that we're going to fail. My dad used to say, the only person who has never struck out in baseball is someone who never went to the plate. The only one who has never failed is someone who's never tried. And I think that's kind of an appropriate thought for this. Anyway, he says to begin with core values. So is anybody, the discussion that followed the presentation I just made was very good. Yeah, we didn't record it just to allow people to have some privacy in their thoughts. And there were some really deep thoughts shared, and it was a wonderful conversation. A couple things I do want to just kind of summarize in a broad sense. One is that Bishop Curry talks about looking at your rule of life is a way to support you. It is not a dictatorial control over you, rather to give you some guidance for yourself. And it's guidance that you write for yourself. It's not coming from outside. It's coming from you saying, this is how I wish I lived my life. Now, one of the things we talked about quite a bit was, and I used this earlier in the video, the idea that we should never let our desire to be perfect prevent us from being better. In other words, move forward even if it's not perfection. Do our best. And allow that we're going to make mistakes. It's interesting, if you look at his chapter on his appendix, rather, he talks about love as being one of the goals. And I thought at first when I first saw that, it was kind of like, of course it is. That's what the whole book's about. But what he's talking about is loving ourselves, being easy on ourselves, setting reasonable, realistic goals. We then went on and talked some about the core values, and I think most everybody pretty much had the same core values. We talked about the importance of humility as one of the core values Bishop Curry mentions, and how that ties into being less judgmental and listening. And I use myself as an example, when I can remember that I'm not perfect, I don't know everything, then it's easier for me not to be judgmental of other people. One of the members used the example of driving, and she tries to remember that there's been times that she's made a mistake and maybe missed an exit or whatever, and therefore tries not to be as angry at the other drivers when they make a mistake. I think that's the sense that we're trying to use humility in. But the last thing we talked about some was the core values and the vows. Probably we'd all come up with something fairly similar. How to accomplish those, how to implement those, how to make them part of our life. Bishop Curry talks about the importance of developing some habits. If we develop habits, then when we don't do what we've said we want to do, it'll feel wrong. And we will do some things that we've said we want to do somewhat automatically because they are a habit. There's been a lot of talk, for example, about how attendance in churches will be much lower as COVID ends, or the worst part of COVID ends, because people are out of the habit of going to church on Sunday. And they have other habits now. It may be playing golf, it may be whatever, maybe sleeping in. But because their habits have changed, their behavior will change. Now we need to think through, what habits do we want? We talked a lot about things like daily prayer, meditation, exercise, all being good habits. We talked about the fact that all of those are focused inwardly, and that's important. But we also want to focus outwardly to the society. So possibly one habit that we might develop is that on the first of every month, we sit down and think about, what can I do during the upcoming month to make the world a better place around some type of situation or issue? Racial reconciliation, homelessness, hunger, whatever it is. What habit can I build to make that happen? Starting with setting a goal for myself. And I just think the first of the month is a good time to do that kind of thing. Anyway, we had a great time. I did anyway. And it's certainly our hope to continue these. So if you weren't part of this, or if you were, please let us know. You just send me a message via Facebook, or if you have my email, and tell us what topics you think would be fun to have this kind of conversation around, what books, movies, whatever. That would be great. We'll then, Sarah in Mount Airy and John, the pastor in Clayton, and I will have a conversation and try to work something out to get as many of these done over the next however long as we possibly can. So thank you very much for being part of this. Blessings. Have a great week.